Hello, everybody. My name is Vanja Sabanac, and I'm Product Marketing Manager for MiVoice MX1. Here by my side, I have Eddie Lambert. He's a Product Manager for MX1 and our MX1 guru. So this is the second part of the webinar on demand webinar we are doing for our Mitel people and our partners. So we will have a little bit deeper dive into news in 7.0. So welcome, Eddie.
Thank you. Okay, so in the first part of this presentation, part one, Vanja presented this slide, which gave you the new things that are happening with MX17 in the three different areas, which we understand to be the major benefits, or shall we say, that we talk about when we talk about MX1. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to go into a lot more detail on each one of these. Now, if we go into a little bit more detail as to what's new with 7.0, we can see that we're introducing this LS12 database, which offers us longevity on the platform for at least the next 10 years with enhanced security, and it introduces native support of KVM. We'll also be introducing a new Cassandra database, which is a replacement to the existing OpenLDAP database. The main difference here is the fact that it offers multi-master technology, which improves security and redundancy options. But we'll get into that in a little bit more detail later. We'll also be doing a refresh of the Java framework for the management system to make it more modernized and more secure. And we'll be introducing some new hardware, which improves our redundancy in the branch office situations. If we look a little bit at this LS12, of course, the main thing is that we'll be updating the components to the latest and greatest. So we'll be replacing the existing LS11 SP4 that we're using in MX16. As I say, it offers us a longer-term sustainability on the product. And besides the latest components, there'll be some updates, the latest updates for components like Java and Postgres. Now, if we look a little bit at the Cassandra database here, it's a major difference. We're moving away from the OpenLDAP database we had before, which was a master-slave technology, meaning you could only have one database writing and the others, and it would replicate to the other slave databases. Whereas in this case, you can have multiple databases that can write. The major advantage for us is that it would allow us to do moves, adds, and changes in a backup situation. So if you had the database located either on the service node itself, you could have two databases, one in the primary server and one in the backup server, so that you could maintain read-write capability in a normal situation or in a backup situation. The other thing that it brings is the fact that you could offload the database onto a separate server and have a rack, shall we say, architecture, so that you can have multiple servers addressing the same database. So like server 1, 2, and 3 could address a database in one data center, and then you could have server 4, 5, and 6 addressing a database in a secondary server. But we'll get a little bit, let's give a couple of examples on this. So if we take your typical database, and we'll assume a rack database in this particular instance where you have service node 1 and service node 2. So you have your primaries in service node 1 in rack 1 and service node 2 in rack 2. All right. And then you have your standby servers that are in the opposite, shall we say, racks. So you would have the standby for service node 1 in rack 2 and the standby for service node 2 in rack 1. And each of those racks have their own databases. It turns out in this particular instance, we decided to offload them from the service node itself, all right, into a rack database structure. So if we take the normal situation, you would have service node 1 active and service node 2 active in their respective racks. Everything business as usual. You've offloaded your provisioning manager so that there's no single point of failure. And then if for any reason service node 1 would fail, service node 1 in the backup rack or in the rack 2 would take over, and then business as usual. The difference here with the OpenLDAP structure is that you can continue to do moves, adds, and changes even when service node 1 is in a backup situation. Now, should you for any reason lose the entire rack, Well, that's okay too, because service node 2 would still be active. Service node 1 would be in backup, its backup standby server mode, and you have access to the secondary database, which is in rack 2. This means that you continue to do moves, adds, and changes regardless if the entire rack, rack 1 is offline. So the only time that it would really be a problem is if you had a double failure, shall we say, or a catastrophic failure where you lost both databases and there's no database to write to, in which case business would continue in terms of service to the users. You could make calls, all that sort of thing, but you would not be able to do moves, adds, and changes in that particular case. But as soon as that database were to come back, then you would be in a situation where you could do moves, adds, and changes. And if service node 2 went down, then the backup service node would take over as usual, and you would be back to business as usual, and you could do your moves, adds, and changes. So that was just a bit of a highlight explaining how this database, new database structure can affect existing customers or new customers wishing to have a higher level of redundancy. If we look a little bit from a management perspective, we're seeing that we're changing the entire JBoss, shall we say, infrastructure or framework, a new also web server infrastructure in there, and with the introduction of Wildfly, which largely improves the authentication security of the system, but also enables us to have support, native support for things like IPv6, in the management application as well as in the service node itself. So this means that we can configure a complete IPv6 network directly from the provisioning manager and service node manager going forward. One of the advantages here is that it will have a smaller footprint, which means better performance, and it is a prerequisite to us being able to, shall we say, redesign the web interface to reduce the number of steps, shall we say, in terms of configuration. So it's a win-win situation for existing customers, and definitely a step in the right direction when it comes to the management framework. We'll also be introducing more support for virtualization. As you know, today we have full support for VMware, including HA and FT, which is still the preferred solution when you want a high level of availability or redundancy. But also we'll have support for KVM and for Hyper-V for those customers who'd like a mixed environment or they want to run virtualization other platforms than VMware. Now, in terms of enhancements for security, we've added some new functionality, which is also applicable, by the way, with MX1 6.3 SP3. It's to help our customers be compliant with the new legislature in Europe. And so some things that we've done to make that easier for our customers is, for example, encryption of data at rest, CSTA application authentication to improve the security at that level, expanding the password from 10 digits to 30 digits and adding character support for logins, for example, enabling the audit logs by default, passwords stored, the passwords that are stored will be hashed and salted, making it impossible to read, having TLS 1.2 as a default encryption mechanism, and of course updating the EOLA for MX1. And all this is described in documentation in the CPI. So we have a document that first describes what customers can do to improve their security in terms of data access and data protection, and also where to points them in the right direction, which documents they need to go to be able to manage their personal data, that type of thing. Now, if we talk a little bit about licensing simplification, what this really means is we're moving away from the device type centric licensing to a user-based licensing approach. This means one license for everything. You don't need to have a different license for every type of terminal you have. You also won't need licenses for CTI call control or for EDN or additional device. All this goes away and we just have one single license, which we call a MX1 user license. The advantages to that are very simple, is that a customer can decide from one day to the next that they move away from let's say a DTS terminal and they want to go to SIP. Then they just simply deactivate the DTS user and redefine him as a SIP user. It's the user license that counts. It's not, we don't care what kind of device that the device license he has. All right, so this will help our customers maintain their total cost of ownership or reduce their total cost of ownership, because they don't have to not only buy the new terminal and the application, but they don't no longer have to be worried about having to purchase migration licenses in the system. This is what you really call investment protection. It's another word for investment protection. Now, if we have a look at the some other resiliency options that have been added to the system, I would talk about load balancing on the media server as one and also being able to have a media server in a backup server, which wasn't the case in MX1.6. This means that you have a level of an enhanced level of redundancy in a 1+1 situation. So if you lose your primary server and your media server that was on there, you can reestablish a media server on the backup server. The other thing that we did was to add load balancing between media servers, because as you know, on any given server, you can have more than one media server. You can have up to 15 for that matter. And then you can have media servers on different servers in the system. Now with this in MX1.7, it's possible to say, okay, I'm going to do load balancing within the same server, so that when there are requests for RTP resources that are coming in, the server 1, for example, would distribute that evenly across the different media servers that he has control of. And if it reaches a certain threshold, you can even say, hey, server 2, do you have some media resources I can borrow? So it's a good way of doing load balancing to make sure that you have enough media resources distributed across the system. Keeps the performance even and distributes the load across different media server resources. The other thing that we're introducing is a new branch office gateway, or at least two models. One's called the EX, which is basically has an MX1 KVM machine loaded in it, and then we have a GX version, which is a self-sufficient gateway for branch office survivability, primarily SIP phones and analog. If you need things like integrated DECT or DTS, you would use the existing media servers media gateways that already exist. Now let's have a quick look at, before we get into more detail on this new hardware, let's look at the hardware that supported, the existing hardware that supported and going forward. Before we get into the details on the new gateway hardware, let's talk a little bit about the requirements going forward with MiVoice MX1.7. Of course, because we're introducing the Cassandra database, there'll be a need for more memory and more CPU. First generation ASUE and ASU Lite will no longer be supported. They don't have enough memory, and they're not strong enough in terms of processing power. We'll also be recommending strongly that customers move to SSD storage as in solid-state drives rather than hard drives, the HDD technology, due to the performance, with a minimum of 128 gigabit. Supported hardware going forward, of course, it'd be the Dell 330 series with a minimum V5 CPU and 32 gig of memory for the larger installations if you have like more than 5,000 users in a bare metal deployment. ASU2 with an Intel 7 processor is fully supported. It has 16 gig of memory, and it's good for up to around 4,000 users. The new generation ASU Lite with the J1900 processor and 8 gig of memory is sufficient for smaller installations of 1,000 users or less. The CPI documentation, particularly in the capacities document, has been updated to reflect the requirements in terms of CPU and memory with all the different types of installations you can have, whether it be a complete installation with service node and different components, or the service node by itself, or provisioning manager by itself, or whatever. So read the capacities document to get full details on this. From a media gateway hardware perspective, the MGU and MGU2 based 19-inch chassis hardware are fully supported. Okay, but the LSUE based media gateway is no longer supported with MX1.7, even in a 19-inch chassis hardware deployment. Also, it's important to state, and this is something that most of you already know and have known for years, is that the stackable hardware will no longer be supported with MX1.7. Now let's get into some detail on the new EX and GX hardware. As stated previously, there are two versions of this new survivable gateways. One which we call the EX controller, which actually can run call manager software in it, and the other one is the GX gateway, which is a standalone survivable gateway for smaller branch offices. In the next slides, I'm going to get a little bit more into detail of the differences between these two. Now, if we look at the EX control a little bit more in detail, it's basically a remote server that's located in a branch office. Now, it can be run in two modes. Either it's a remote server to a main site system, or it's equivalent to an SBN or survivable branch node, if you wish, as a standalone MX1 system. In either case, you're running a KVM machine inside on a separate processor here, which is a Celeron processor. It can support up to 500 users locally. And you also have the PSTN trunks, which you can plug in, as well as analog extensions, up to 28 analog extensions. Here you have pop packs that can be plugged in, up to 8 different pop packs. So they can be PRI or they can be analog trunks, and you can have 1 to 4 PRI as well as up to 24 analog trunks in this box. And these are field upgradable, meaning that you can add and take away trunk lines or analog extensions on the fly on these boxes. All right. If we go to the next, the GX model, the main difference here is that there you don't have an MX1 software running inside of it. It's actually a standalone, self-sufficient gateway that is a back-to-back proxy, if you would, towards the MX1 in the central site. So the phones actually register to this box, which then re-registers to the MX1 in the central site. The MX1 then connects to this box, sees this box as SIP extensions, and on the other side we'll have a SIP trunk to be able to access the PSTN trunks, which are located inside this box. As with the previous box, you can have PRI or analog trunks, but the difference here is these are preset configurations that you buy off the shelf with the PRI or the analog trunks, as well as analog extensions pre-installed. If we look a little bit at the feature set, it can be split up into 4 different areas. You can look into the documentation to get a little bit more detail, but you can see there's an array of different types of protocols that are supported, as well as very strong security, as well as SIP standards in the box. Now, we've looked at basically what's new with MX17, so the question that begs to be asked is, why would customers migrate to MX17? I think it's pretty clear that the investment protection is there for existing MX1 customers. Okay, with under active SWA, then they get access to all the new functionality. For existing MD110 and TSW customers, then they can take advantage of the attractive migration program, which is going to be launched at the same time with this release. Of course, the main reason, I think, for a lot of customers, whether they be existing MX1 customers on earlier versions, or whether they be TDM or legacy customers with MD110 or TSW, is the license simplification. Because here, they're going to be able to keep what their already made investments, move over to the new MX1 system, and then at any point in time they can decide, I want to convert this DTS to a SIP extension. And then all they need to do is purchase the additional SIP terminals or the UCC bundles they need, like MiCollab, for example, bundles that they would need to complement the existing installation. So it's a good cost control for the customer. He's not losing any investments that he's already made. It's very, very strong argument there for a customer to want to migrate over. And of course, the consolidation of the existing infrastructure using environmentally friendly hardware, smaller footprint, that type of thing makes sense, as well as the new strong redundancy options and survivability options, either because they're distributed architecture, they're distributed site, and they don't want to have servers in every site, then they can use the GX gateway as a survivable gateway. Also, the new multi-master database allows them to do moves as. And finally, of course, MX17 is a prerequisite for the cloud-based applications of the future. So it'll have full integration with CloudLink, meaning that when the new applications come on our CloudLink portal, customers will have access and can be able to subscribe to them, and they will connect into the MX1 using the CloudLink gateway option. Now let's have a quick look at the Suround applications that will be introduced around the same time as the MX17. First of all, let's have a quick look at MiCollab Release 8.1, which will be released in the beginning of October. There are 4 main areas of improvement. I would start with the user experience in that we've introduced now a full range of next generation clients, and we've added some features to that, like right clicking and stuff like that, to make it the user experience a little bit easier. We're also introducing the whole mobility aspect with replacing the MMC shall we say, products with MiCollab. So on the mobile client, you'll be able to do call through, call back, all these different things, and be able to do roaming between mobile and Wi-Fi network, although it's static instead of automatic. So the customer just presses a button and then they move from their Wi-Fi to their cellular network and vice versa. Okay, so then it makes it much easier to make a difference between business and private calls, and things like the take feature and stuff like that will be included as part of that release. Also, we'll be introducing a bit later after the release of 8.1 in the first service pack a new Skype for Business plugin. This will have a much stronger Skype for Business look and feel, better integration, shall we say, and so we will create a new UCC bundle called Skype for Business bundle. And then there'll be some security aspects also that are being introduced with 8.1, which I'll get into in the next slide. If we look a little bit on the security side, I would say general security updates to help our customers reach GDPR compliance. There's privacy policy, license improvements, and there's also documentation that's been introduced into the release to explain where to find information in the documentation regarding document access and document protection. Okay, improved AWV ciphers, support for SSH2, those type of things. We'll also be introducing a couple of other things, whether it be NewPoint standalone to MiCollab migration support, so there'll be better integration. So if a customer had a NewPoint system, he can migrate it over to MiCollab when he buys MiCollab without having to do a complete reinstall. Also things like virtual desktop will be supported with Citrix and Windows Terminal, that type of thing, but it's for CTI mode only. It's not really voice, so we're not going to be introducing voice or video as part of that, but for CTI call control. We move on to the MiCC Enterprise highlights. Okay, the highlights are mainly around security and some improvements to the web agent, web reporting, as well as the attendant capability in the release. First of all, let's talk a little bit about security. I would say that there's been some improvement in terms of the access control using HTTPS protocols between all the sessions between the different services within a MiCC Enterprise installation. Also TLS SRTP encryption, doing TLS encryption, for example, in the CSTA link, which is something that we support quite well on the MX1 already today. All right, and there's been a lot of changes in terms of the way the password is handled, password handling is done, shall we say, to make it a high grade, shall we say, password protection system. So you have to change your password every 90 days or 30 days or whatever you set. You can't reuse old passwords, that sort of thing. You have to have a minimum length, a minimum characters, that sort of thing. So a lot of improvements in terms of security with 9.3, which was introduced in May. And on the web agent side now, there's full CTI call control support, so there's a lot of improvements done there. So this would be the first release where we consider the web agent to be fully functional. So a lot of functionality. You can use the web agent. You don't need the thick client any longer. Pretty much the web agent can do pretty much everything that the thick client can do. So there's a lot of things. The only thing missing, of course, is the soft phone. You don't have the soft phone capability, so this web client would be connected to a mobile phone, your SIP phone, whatever, or your desk phone, and it would do complete call control on that. We look a little bit at the web manager. We've added some new functionality in the web manager to be able to have better reporting. So you have different reports that you can pre-made reports that you can directly click on, depending on the groups or service groups that you're using. All right, so there's different new possibilities there. If we look Look a little bit at the attendant agent enhancements. We introduced the attendant capability on the thick client not that long ago in the 9.0 release, and now we've made some improvements on that to add things like busy lamp fields, like manual recalls, and setting activities of other users to basically complete the functionality that was missing when we initially introduced it. So now it's a full functional, shall we say, attendant, which means that a MiCC enterprise agent can also play the role of an attendant with full functionality. If we look a little bit at MiVoice Advanced Messaging, which we are also introducing with this release, we see there's some improvements there. I'm not going to read down the whole list, but I would say some slight improvements in terms of capacity, support for Windows 2016, including Hyper-V support, better integration with better new forms for the Microsoft Exchange Office 365, and some privacy improvements. So if we go into a little bit more detail on the capacity side of things, we see that we can go from 40,000 to 60,000 users in one system. And even the advanced users, shall we say, which are integration into voicemail, can go up to 60,000 users as well. That is a rather large enhancements. From the ports perspective, it was already quite high at 750. Now we can go up to 800. So there's some improvements in terms of capacity, but also some improvement in terms of security. Now we've introduced the support for EFS on the server side, where you have your voicemail stored, meaning that all voicemails will be now encrypted. This is to help with data protection regulations that are running in EU these days. So you can have encryption of messages on the system server as well as the ones that are stored on the call server until they're actually transferred over to the system server. Okay. And then we have secure sessions, whether it be SIP, SRTP, or whatever, as well as secure SMTP for emails. All that stuff is in terms of transport, so meaning that all the sessions between the different components in the system are secure. If we look a little bit at private message, it means that we can differentiate between a message which is, if a message is marked private, then it means that it will never be transferred and never be transferred away. We have better control of how messages are handled in the system to make sure that they're not inadvertently sent to the wrong person, or so some options are disabled when a message is marked private. We'll also be introducing a solution from VoiceBase, which is a speech-to-text. It's a subscription service that can be added to your MiCam system, and it can be either a MiCollab AM 9.0 or a MiCollab AM 6.1. Either way, you have a setup fee, plus you have an annual subscription per user if you want to have speech-to-text done on your voicemails. If we look a little bit on some other things, as we said before, will be support for Windows Server 2016, some new forms, Outlook forms to minimize disruption, and also on the Gmails and improvements on the integration with Gmail with message waiting indication support, but that would require a unified messaging license. We look a little bit on the desktop software. We'll be introducing, shortly after the release of MX1, we'll be introducing the 5.1 firmware at the end of September, which is basically the merge between the 6800 phone software and the 6900 phone software. So today in the 6800 you have the 4.5, and on the 6900 you have the 5.0 SP2. These will all the functionality be merged together, so you'll have one common software base for both lines of phones. It'll also introduce the first time that we have IPv4 and IPv6 support in the phones. They will not be supported at the same time. It'll be one or the other, but it's simply a reboot of the phone to change from IPv4 to IPv6 and vice versa. We'll also be introducing support for the DECT headset, which is a side panel. Basically, you plug into the phone to a 6930 or 6940 that allows more mobility, shall we say, further away from the desk, shall we say. When you have the DECT headset, you have you can walk, tens of meters away from your phone and still maintain a high quality connection as we're using DECT as a protocol. And later in the year, towards the end of the year, we'll be introducing a Bluetooth speakerphone, which would be a complement to a 6930 or 6940 that's sitting in a smaller conference room. These speakerphones can just be placed on the desk, and they will be paired automatically to the phone. And they have speakers built in, so provide high quality speakerphone capability in a medium-sized conference room. You can even have a couple of them linked together so that you could spread them out in a larger conference room setting. So there we go. There's your lineup for the rest of the year and going forward. Yes, we will maintain 6.3 the 6.3 line going forward. That will be maintained at least for the next couple of years. So you'll have both lines running at the same time. But MX17 is, of course, you can see from the improvements that have been done to MX17 that it's the obvious choice for in terms of security, redundancy, as well as the license simplification, the new gateways and stuff like that. It's an obvious choice. Well, okay, this concludes the second part 2 of this webinar. I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you from both of us. So it was quite a short one, almost a little bit more than 30 minutes. Very short to be pre-sales, Eddie.
Well, thank you anyway, and I wish you happy sales with MiVoice MX17 and the rest of the portfolio.
Thank you. Bye.